Let's begin with John chapter 11, verses 1 through 45. Here's the gospel for the fifth Sunday of Lent. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness is not unto death, for it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by means of it. All right, pause there. Notice something real quick, that this story contains the characters of Mary and Martha, the two sisters, who also appear only in the Gospel of Luke, with the famous account of Martha busy with much serving, while Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet and listening to his teaching. So John here appears to assume that you know who those characters are, right? So keep that in mind as we move through the story, because you're going to see the characteristics of Mary, who's very contemplative, and Martha, who's very active, showing up in this gospel as well. Now let's keep going. Verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. All right, pause. Notice this. John explicitly says that the reason Jesus stays longer once he hears that Lazarus is sick is because he loved him. Now, that's a puzzle. We're gonna have to come back to that. But it's really important to note it as we're moving through the story. So it continues. Then after this he said to the disciples, Let us go into Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were but now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. Okay, pause there. Notice last week we looked at the raising of Lazarus, at the man born blind, where Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and that those who don't recognize him as such are spiritually blind. So here, when the disciples say, let's go into Judea again, he's using that term Jews to refer to the Judeans, meaning the southerners, the people of Jerusalem and the south who rejected Jesus as a Galilean coming down from the north. So that's what he's getting at here, those who don't see the light of the world, who are spiritually blind. He's not talking about religious Jews, because Mary's a Jew, Martha's a Jew, Lazarus is a Jew. Okay, he's talking about the southerners versus the Galileans. Just keep that in mind as we're walking through. In other words, Judea, Jerusalem, and the city in the south is becoming dangerous. And so the disciples say, why do you want to go back there? They're going to kill you. Now, keep going. Verse 11, Jesus spoke, and he said to them, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awake him out of sleep. Now the disciples said to him, Oh, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, then he will recover, right? So they think that Lazarus is just, taking a long nap, or maybe he's in a coma or something, like he's asleep. But Jesus says, now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. And then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go that we may die with him. Pause there. Notice Thomas recognizes Judea is getting dangerous for Jesus and his disciples, and yet he's willing to go and die for Christ. So we always talk about Thomas as the doubting Thomas, but we forget he's also courageous Thomas. He's the one who's willing to go into dangerous territory with Jesus to die with him. All right, now, verse 17. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews, I think many of the Judeans, had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary sat in the house. All right, pause there. Notice Martha's active just like she was in the Gospel of Luke. She rushes out to meet Jesus, while Mary sits quietly in the house. Their personalities really come through. In verse 21, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, Oh, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, he who is coming into the world." Okay, pause there. Notice what just happened. Lazarus is dead. He's been dead 4 days. When Jesus comes, Mary says, if you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened, which the reader now knows isn't true, because Jesus knew about Lazarus' sickness and that he was going to die, but he stayed longer and allowed it to happen. So then Jesus says to to Martha, "Your brother will rise again." Martha thinks he's talking about Lazarus being raised from the dead on the last day at the final judgment, because the Jews had a tradition, going back to the book of Daniel and other places, Isaiah, that at the end of time, at the end of this world, all of the dead would be raised in their bodies for the final judgment on the last day. So Martha misunderstands Jesus. She thinks he's talking about the resurrection at the end of time, and Jesus is actually talking about Lazarus' resurrection that's about to take place. And so when he asks Martha, "Do you believe in me?" Martha makes a confession of faith that's almost as great as Peter's in the Gospel of Matthew. "You are the Christ, the Son of God, he who is to come into the world." Right? So again, we often think about Martha just because of her anxiety over serving, but we want to remember that she was also a woman of great faith who made one of the most important confessions of faith in all the Gospels, recognizing Jesus as the Messiah and as the Son of God. Now, what about Mary, her sister? Verse 28. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying quietly, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Then Mary, when she came where Jesus was and saw him, fell at his feet, saying to him, same thing as Martha said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said, "Lord, come and see." And then we have the shortest verse in John's Gospel, very famous verse, Jesus wept. Just 2 words, Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Notice here that the Judeans make the same mistake that Mary and Martha make. That if Jesus loved Lazarus, he wouldn't have let him suffer and die. If he'd loved Lazarus, he would have prevented his sickness, he would have prevented his death. And that's really important to grasp, that they don't fully understand what Jesus' purposes are in this miracle. They don't understand how Jesus can both love Lazarus and yet allow him to remain in his suffering, to remain in his sickness, and even to die. And Jesus is about to show us why he did it in the next verses. So let's keep going. Verse 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, always practical, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor," or a stench, "for he has been dead 4 days." Pause for just 1 second. Notice that John has twice emphasized that Lazarus has been dead 4 days. Why does he do that? Well, in a first century Jewish context, many Jews believed that the soul departed definitively from the body after the 3rd day. So that in the Mishnah, which is a collection of Jewish laws, it said that you couldn't identify a body, like for legal purposes, after the 3rd day. And the reason this was the case was because Jews did not embalm bodies. They actually allowed the body to decompose. They would use spices and things to cover the odor, but they didn't embalm a body like the Egyptians, because when a Jew would be buried, they would put him in a cave and allow the body to decompose, and then later come back about a year or 2 and gather up the bones and then put the bones into an ossuary, a bone box. And that's how they would keep the remains of their loved ones. So without any embalming whatsoever, after 3 days, there is definitely going to be an odor, and the body would have begun to decompose. right? So Martha's aware of that, and she's concerned about the stench coming from the tomb. How does Jesus respond? Look at verse 40. Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. I knew that thou hearest me always, but I have said this on account of the people standing by, that they may believe that thou didst send me." And when he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with bandages, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Now many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. End of gospel. Okay, a lot going on here. What can we say about this passage? What did it mean in its first century context? And then why does the church choose it for the last Sunday of Lent before Passion Sunday, before Palm Sunday, right? The kind of climax of the Lenten journey before we enter into Holy Week. A couple of things. Number one, clearly the passage is focused on suffering and death. Right? And Jesus explains at the very beginning that the illness of Lazarus is not unto death, not meaning that he wouldn't die physical death, right? But rather that it's not going to end permanently in death, but rather it's going to be for the glory of God. So Jesus is going to use the death of his friend Lazarus as an opportunity to show the glory of God, to show the power of God, to show the power of Jesus over not just suffering, but death and even decay itself, the decomposition of the body. Right? So this is one of Jesus' most powerful signs. It's one of his greatest miracles in all of the Gospels. And that's one of the reasons I think John records it for us, because it isn't recorded in the other synoptics. And in the synoptics, John wants to make sure we know about this momentous raising of Lazarus from the tomb. Number two, why does Jesus wait 2 days longer to go to Judea? Well, this is an interesting thing. John says very specifically that Jesus did this because he loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. That's a very mysterious thing. I mean, can you imagine a situation where, so let's say I'm giving a lecture in class at the seminary, and my wife calls and says, you know, your daughter is very sick, right? Very, very sick. I think she might be dying. And I would respond, okay, well, I'm going to stay here at work a couple of days longer because I love her. I mean, that's totally counterintuitive. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But Jesus isn't an ordinary man. He doesn't have an ordinary love for Lazarus. He allows Lazarus, his friend, to suffer and die because he's going to bring him back from the grave. And in the living tradition, St. John Chrysostom, different fathers of the church would explain it this different ways, but St. John Chrysostom said this about this, quote, he said, "Many are offended when they see any of those who are pleasing to God suffering anything terrible. Those who are offended by this, however, do not know that those who are especially dear to God have it as their lot to endure such things, as we see in the case of Lazarus, who was also one of the friends of Christ, but was also sick." So what Chrysostom is pointing out here is there's a mysterious reality about the Christian life, that those who are called to a special holiness, those who in a sense God loves in a special way, he often, frequently allows to suffer in a special way. He allows to suffer in a great way. I mean, and if you want any proof of this, just look at the life, pick the life of any great saint. John Paul II, St. John Paul II, he has his Parkinson's, right? St. Bernadette of Subaru had a tumor. St. Therese of Lisieux, tuberculosis. To say nothing of all the martyrs, right? Who God allows not just to suffer, but to be put to death for the sake of their faith. So on a natural level, you would see that and you would say, God must not love these people because they're sick and they're suffering and they're dying. And what John is revealing to us here is, no. God, those whom God loves in a special way, he draws into the mystery of the cross. He draws into the mystery of his own suffering and his own death. I'll never forget the first time I started reading the lives of the saints. I was like, I'd like to be a saint one day. Let me read the lives of the saints. And then I start reading it, every one of them, sickness, illness, suffering, their family members die, they lose their mother, they lose their father, they lose their wife. And I began thinking, I'm not so sure I want to be a saint anymore. I mean, this looks awful, right? Because they're always undergoing physical calamities and physical suffering. But the reality is that in the midst of that, God's drawing them closer to the love that he showed them on the cross. And that's what Chrysostom's saying here about Lazarus. Now, does that mean that Jesus doesn't feel the pain of Lazarus's suffering, or that it makes his suffering somehow good? No. When Jesus encounters the suffering of Lazarus, when he encounters the fact that Lazarus has died and been buried, what does he do? In his humanity, he weeps, just like Martha. He feels the fullness of the pain of the loss of Lazarus. And there's a beautiful quote from St. Augustine that I have, where Augustine said, why did Jesus weep? Right? Everyone sees that verse, Jesus wept. Why did he weep? Augustine says, why did Christ weep except to teach us to weep? In other words, Christ does not diminish the reality and the horror of suffering by redeeming it. He fully participates in that, and he shows us that to weep and to mourn over the suffering and death of the world is natural, and it's a good thing. He himself does it. He recognizes that suffering and death is an evil, right? And he feels the pain of that loss in his own human heart. However, he allows it to take place because there's a greater glory to be revealed. St. Peter Chrysologus said this in his homily on the raising of Lazarus. He said, the reason Jesus allowed Lazarus to suffer and die is, quote, because for Christ it was more important to conquer death than it was to cure disease. He showed his love for his friend not by healing him, but by calling him back from the grave. Instead of a remedy for his illness, he offered him the glory of rising from the dead. And this really gets to the essence of why the church picks the story of the raising of Lazarus for the 5th Sunday in Lent. Because this is the last Sunday before Palm Sunday. And what we're preparing to celebrate during Holy Week is the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the last miracle she's going to put before us on the 5th Sunday of Lent, before we get to Holy Week, is Jesus' demonstration of his power over sin and death in the raising of Lazarus, to show that he has power over the grave, that he can raise Lazarus from the dead, even after the tomb has been closed for 4 days and Lazarus' body has begun to rot, has begun to decompose. That is no barrier to Jesus' power to give him life. That's the meaning of this miracle. In other words, it's a sign that points forward to the resurrection of Christ that we'll be celebrating on Easter Sunday.